A 1906 portrait of a mother and son. Experts are confused by her expression. In the spring of 2023, Dr. Elizabeth Barnes received an unexpected package at her office in the American Studies Department at Columbia University. The sender, an elderly woman from Rochester, New York, had inherited a collection of family photographs and wanted them evaluated for historical significance before donating them to a local museum. Among the dozens of typical early 20th century family portraits, one photograph immediately captured Dr. Barnes's attention. The formal studio portrait, dated April 12, 1906, showed a well-dressed woman in her 30s, seated beside a boy of approximately 8 years old. The photographer's embossed stamp indicated it had been taken at Morrison's photography studio in Rochester, an establishment known for serving the city's affluent families. At first glance, the portrait appeared conventional for its era. The woman wore a high-necked dark dress with intricate beadwork, her hair styled in the Gibson girl fashion popular during the Progressive era. The boy, presumably her son, stood beside her chair wearing a sailor suit with short pants and knee-high stockings, his hand resting formally on her shoulder. The studio setting was typical of professional portraiture from 1906. An ornate chair, decorative backdrop, and carefully arranged lighting that emphasized the subject's respectability and social status. Everything about the composition suggested this was a commemorative portrait of a prosperous mother and her well-cared-for child. Yet something about the woman's expression troubled Dr. Barnes profoundly. In her 15 years of studying historical photography, she had examined thousands of period portraits, becoming familiar with the range of expressions people typically displayed for formal photographs. The stoic composure, slight smiles, or serious dignity were all standard for the era when long exposure times required subjects to maintain steady poses. This woman's expression defied categorization. Her eyes held an intensity that seemed to burn through the sepia tones, conveying a mixture of determination, desperation, and what could only be described as barely controlled terror. Most disturbing was the contrast between her facial expression and her body language. While her posture remained formally correct for a studio portrait, her face told a completely different story. The boy beside her appeared normal, even cheerful, showing no awareness of whatever internal struggle his mother was experiencing. Dr. Barnes's initial examination of the photograph revealed technical details that deepened the mystery surrounding the woman's expression. The image quality was exceptional for 1906, suggesting Morrison's photography studio employed the latest equipment and techniques available during the early days of commercial portrait photography. However, several anomalies became apparent under careful scrutiny. The woman's hands, folded in her lap, showed signs of tension that contradicted the formal pose. Her knuckles appeared white even in the sepia tones, and the fabric of her dress showed subtle wrinkles that suggested her hands were clenched with considerable force. More puzzling still was the timing evident in the photograph. Studio portraits of this era typically required exposure times of several seconds, during which subjects needed to remain perfectly still. Yet the woman's expression suggested someone in acute emotional distress, hardly the mental state conducive to the patience and composure required for successful portrait photography. Dr. Barnes consulted with colleagues specializing in historical photography techniques. Professor Michael Chen from the Rochester Institute of Technology's photography program examined the technical aspects of the image, confirming that the exposure had been properly executed despite what appeared to be challenging circumstances. The lighting is professional, the focus is sharp, and the composition follows standard studio practices of the period, Professor Chen noted. But there's something about this woman's expression that suggests she was struggling to maintain composure throughout the session. Look at the slight blur around her eyes. That's consistent with someone fighting back tears or experiencing involuntary facial movements. Dr. Barnes also consulted Dr. Sarah Whitfield, a psychologist who specialized in analyzing historical documents for evidence of mental health conditions. Dr. Whitfield's assessment was equally perplexing. The woman's expression shows classic signs of someone experiencing extreme stress or fear, Dr. Whitfield observed. Her eyes are wide with what appears to be hypervigilance, and the muscle tension around her mouth suggests she's consciously controlling her facial expression. But what's most unusual is that she's managing to maintain a formal pose while clearly in psychological distress. This suggests either exceptional self-control or that she felt compelled to complete this portrait session despite her emotional state. The contrast between the woman's obvious distress and the boy's apparent contentment added another layer to the mystery. Children of that era were typically sensitive to their parents' emotional states, yet this boy showed no signs of concern or awareness of his mother's condition. Determined to understand the story behind the mysterious portrait, Dr. Barnes began researching the identity of the mother and son. The photograph's back bore only the studio's stamp and the date, with no names or other identifying information. However, the quality of their clothing and the expensive studio settings suggested they belonged to Rochester's upper social classes. Morrison's photography studio had been one of Rochester's most prestigious portrait establishments, serving wealthy families, business leaders, and prominent citizens from 1895 to 1920. Dr. Barnes contacted the Rochester Historical Society, hoping their archives might contain records from the studio's operations. The Historical Society's collections included partial business records from Morrison's studio, though many documents had been lost over the decades. What remained provided intriguing clues about the studio's clientele and practices. According to surviving appointment books, the studio typically charged premium rates and required advance booking, especially for formal family portraits. More significantly, the appointment book for April 12, 1906, showed only one portrait session scheduled for that date. Mrs. H. Caldwell and Son, 2:00 p.m., special circumstances, payment in advance. The notation about special circumstances was unusual, as most entries contained only names, times, and standard pricing information. Research into Rochester's prominent families revealed that the Caldwells were indeed among the city's social elite. Henry Caldwell owned a successful manufacturing business that produced agricultural equipment, and the family lived in one of Rochester's most fashionable neighborhoods. Society page mentions from local newspapers showed that Mrs. Helena Caldwell was active in various charitable organizations and frequently appeared at social events throughout the early 1900s. However, Dr. Barnes noticed a significant gap in Mrs. Caldwell's public appearances during early 1906. While society columns regularly mentioned her activities in 1905 and later in 1906, there were virtually no references to her during the first several months of that year, the period immediately surrounding the mysterious portrait session. Census records from 1900 and 1910 confirmed that Helena Caldwell had a son named William, whose age matched that of the boy in the photograph. But the 1910 census revealed an unexpected detail. William Caldwell was listed as living with his grandparents rather than his parents, with no explanation provided for this unusual arrangement. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to suggest that the Caldwell family had experienced some kind of crisis in early 1906, one significant enough to disrupt normal family arrangements and possibly explain Helena Caldwell's distressed expression during what should have been a routine portrait session. Dr. Barnes's investigation into the Caldwell family hit an unexpected obstacle when she attempted to access official records from 1906. While most public documents from the early 20th century were well preserved in Rochester's archives, records specifically related to the Caldwell family showed suspicious gaps during the crucial time period. Legal records that should have documented property transactions, business dealings, and family matters were either missing or heavily redacted. Most notably, court records from early 1906 contained several sealed files bearing the Caldwell name, with notations indicating the documents remained restricted even after more than a century. Dr. Barnes consulted with legal historians familiar with early 20th century record-keeping practices. Professor James Mitchell from the University of Rochester Law School explained that permanent sealing of family court records was extremely rare and typically reserved for cases involving serious criminal activity or matters of national security. The fact that these records remain sealed after 117 years suggests something extraordinary was involved, Professor Mitchell noted. Standard privacy protections for family matters would have expired decades ago. This level of continued restriction indicates either ongoing legal implications or intervention by parties with significant influence over the record-keeping process. Hospital records from Rochester's major medical facilities also showed anomalies during early 1906. While Helena Caldwell's name appeared in various medical records before and after this period, there was a complete absence of documentation during the first quarter of 1906, unusual for a wealthy woman who would have had regular access to medical care. More intriguingly, Dr. Barnes discovered that several prominent Rochester families had left the city temporarily during early 1906, according to Society page reports that mentioned extended European tours and educational travels. The timing of these departures clustered around the same period as Helena Caldwell's portrait session and subsequent disappearance from public records. Bank records, where available, showed that the Caldwell family's substantial accounts had experienced unusual activity during this period. Large withdrawals and transfers suggested either major business investments or preparation for significant expenses, possibly including extended travel or legal fees. The pattern of missing or restricted records, combined with the evidence of wealthy families leaving Rochester during early 1906, suggested that something significant had occurred in the city's upper social circles. Helena Caldwell's terrified expression during her portrait session appeared to be connected to whatever events had prompted this unusual exodus and subsequent cover-up. The investigation was revealing not just a family mystery, but evidence of a broader scandal that had been carefully concealed by Rochester's most powerful citizens. Dr. Barnes turned her attention to Rochester's newspapers from early 1906, hoping that contemporary reporting might provide clues about whatever events had affected the city's elite families. Her systematic review of the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle archives revealed a curious pattern of reporting during the first quarter of that year. While the newspaper typically covered social events, business news, and local incidents in detail, the early months of 1906 showed an unusual focus on national and international stories. Local coverage was dominated by reports about the San Francisco earthquake in April and political developments in Washington, with remarkably little attention paid to Rochester's usually prominent social scene. However, careful examination revealed what appeared to be deliberate omissions rather than simple editorial choices. Society pages that normally reported on charitable events, business gatherings, and family announcements contained significantly fewer local stories during January through April 1906. Several regular columnists who typically covered Rochester's elite families had apparently taken extended breaks from their reporting duties during this period. More telling were the brief, cryptic items buried in the newspaper's back pages. Dr. E. Barnes found a series of small notices about extended business travel by prominent citizens, temporary family relocations for health reasons, and postponed social events due to unforeseen circumstances. Individually, these items appeared routine, but collectively they suggested a coordinated exodus of Rochester's upper class. The most revealing discovery came in the form of an editorial published on April 15, 1906, just 3 days after Helena Caldwell's mysterious portrait session. The editorial, titled "Maintaining Community Standards," discussed the importance of protecting family privacy and respecting the discretion of our most valued citizens during times of personal difficulty. While the editorial never mentioned specific names or events, its timing and language suggested it was addressing a recent situation involving Rochester's social elite. The piece emphasized that responsible journalism requires careful consideration of the broader community impact when reporting on sensitive family matters, and praised the wisdom of those who seek privacy during challenging circumstances. Dr. Barnes also discovered that the newspaper's editor during this period, Robert Morrison, was the brother of the photographer who had taken Helena Caldwell's portrait. This family connection between the newspaper and the photography studio suggested a potential coordination of efforts to control information about whatever had occurred. Investigation into Robert Morrison's personal papers, housed at the Rochester Historical Society, revealed correspondence with prominent business leaders during early 1906 that discussed maintaining appropriate discretion and protecting community interests during what Morrison referred to as recent unpleasantness. The evidence pointed to a coordinated effort by Rochester's establishment to suppress information about events that had prompted fear, secrecy, and the temporary displacement of several wealthy families. Dr. Barnes's breakthrough came when she gained access to the private medical records of Dr. Edmund Thornfield, who had served as physician to many of Rochester's prominent families during the early 1900s. Dr. Yao Thornfield's detailed patient notes, preserved by his descendants and recently donated to the University of Rochester Medical Center archives, provided an unfiltered view of the medical emergencies that had affected the city's elite during early 1906. Dr. Thornfield's entries for January through April 1906 revealed a disturbing pattern of medical consultations that differed dramatically from his typical practice. Instead of routine examinations and minor ailments, his notes documented a series of cases involving what he described as nervous exhaustion, acute anxiety disorders, and hysteria brought on by extraordinary circumstances. Most significantly, Dr. Thornfield's notes for April 10, 1906, just 2 days before Helena Caldwell's portrait session, contained a detailed entry about Mrs. Caldwell herself. Mrs. H. Caldwell presented with severe symptoms of nervous distress. Patient reports persistent nightmares, inability to sleep, and overwhelming feelings of dread. Physical examination reveals no underlying medical cause. Symptoms appear related to recent traumatic experience. Prescribed laudanum for sleep and recommended immediate removal from current environment. Additional entries revealed that Dr. Thornfield had treated several other prominent women during the same period for similar symptoms. Mrs. Edward Harrison, Mrs. Charles Bennett, and Mrs. William Pemberton had all sought treatment for what the doctor consistently described as nervous conditions resulting from witnessing disturbing events. Dr. Thornfield's notes became increasingly detailed as the crisis continued. His entry for April 12, 1906, the exact date of Helena Caldwell's portrait, provided crucial context. Mrs. Caldwell insisted on proceeding with previously scheduled photography appointment, despite my strong medical recommendation against public appearances in her current condition. Patient states she feels compelled to maintain normal appearances and protect her son from understanding the situation. Expressed concern about patient's judgment and emotional stability. The doctor's subsequent notes revealed that Helena Caldwell's condition had worsened significantly after the portrait session. Patient returned in state of complete emotional collapse following photography appointment, reports being unable to control her expression during session, and fears the photographs will reveal her distress. Recommended immediate travel to distant relatives and complete removal from Rochester environment. Dr. Thornfield's records also documented his treatment of young William Caldwell, providing insight into why the boy had appeared so normal in the portrait, despite his mother's obvious distress. Young William treated for recurring stomach ailments. Patient appears unaware of family crisis, as mother has made extraordinary efforts to shield child from current situation. Recommended maintaining child's routine to preserve sense of normalcy. The medical records painted a picture of a community of women traumatized by something they had witnessed or experienced, with Helena Caldwell among the most severely affected. Her decision to proceed with the portrait session despite her doctor's advice explained the compelling contrast between her formal pose and her expression of barely controlled terror. Dr. Barnes's investigation took a decisive turn when she discovered a connection between the medical records and a largely forgotten industrial incident that had occurred in Rochester during early 1906. While researching Dr. Thornfield's other patients from the period, she noticed that several of the women suffering from nervous conditions were wives of men connected to Rochester's industrial sector. A search through industrial safety records revealed that Caldwell Agricultural Equipment, Henry Caldwell's manufacturing company, had been involved in a serious workplace accident on March 15, 1906. The official incident report, filed with the New York State Department of Labor, described a mechanical failure resulting in worker injuries at the company's main production facility. However, the clinical language of the official report concealed the true horror of what had occurred. Dr. Barnes found more detailed accounts in labor union records and workers' compensation files that painted a drastically different picture of the incident. According to witness statements from surviving workers, the accident had involved a catastrophic failure of the factory's main stamping press, which was used to manufacture agricultural equipment components. The massive machine had malfunctioned during a shift change, when maximum numbers of workers were present in the facility. The union records contained graphic testimony from workers who had witnessed the accident. The press came down while men were still working underneath, one witness reported. The screaming went on for what seemed like hours. Blood everywhere. Some men were crushed completely, others trapped and calling for help we couldn't give them. The death toll, according to labor union documentation, had been far higher than reported in official records. While state filings listed 3 workplace fatalities, union records suggested that as many as 12 workers had died, with many more seriously injured. The discrepancy appeared to result from deliberate underreporting designed to minimize legal liability and public attention. Most significantly, Dr. Barnes discovered that several prominent Rochester families, including the Caldwells, had been present at the factory on the day of the accident. According to internal company documents, Henry Caldwell had organized a tour of the facility for potential investors and their families. scheduled to coincide with a demonstration of the company's latest equipment. Helena Caldwell, along with other investors' wives, had been present in the factory when the stamping press failed. They had witnessed the deaths and injuries firsthand, experiencing trauma that no amount of social privilege could shield them from processing. The portrait session on April 12, 1906, had taken place exactly 4 weeks after Helena Caldwell had watched multiple men die in a horrific industrial accident that her husband's company had attempted to cover up through official channels. The industrial accident at Caldwell Agricultural Equipment had triggered a massive cover-up involving some of Rochester's most powerful families and institutions. Dr. Barnes's continued research revealed the extent to which the city's establishment had worked to suppress information about both the accident's true severity and the presence of prominent citizens as witnesses. Corporate records from Caldwell Agricultural Equipment, obtained through the University of Rochester's Business History Archives, showed that Henry Caldwell had immediately retained Rochester's most expensive legal firm following the accident. The legal strategy, as outlined in preserved attorney correspondence, focused on minimizing official casualty figures and preventing witness testimony from becoming public record. More disturbing were the financial records that showed substantial payments made by Caldwell's company to families of the deceased workers. While these payments were presented as generous compensation for workplace injuries, the accompanying legal documents required recipients to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements that prohibited them from discussing any details of the accident. The payments extended beyond workers' families to include city officials, newspaper editors, and even medical personnel who had responded to the emergency. Dr. Barnes found evidence that the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle had received substantial advertising contracts from Caldwell's company immediately following the accident, coinciding with the newspaper's reduced coverage of local events during early 1906. Hospital records, previously restricted, became accessible through medical history research requests and revealed the true scope of the emergency response. Rochester General Hospital had treated far more patients on March 15, 1906, than reflected in official incident reports. Emergency room logs showed dozens of workers brought in with severe injuries, many of whom had subsequently died from their wounds over the following days and weeks. Most significantly, the hospital records documented the treatment of several prominent women for nervous shock on the day of the accident. Helena Caldwell, along with Mrs. Harrison, Mrs. Bennett, and Mrs. Pemberton, had all been brought to the hospital immediately following their exposure to the industrial disaster. The medical notes from that day provided graphic insight into what these women had witnessed. Dr. Thornfield's emergency report stated, "Mrs. Caldwell and other ladies present during factory incident show severe symptoms of traumatic shock. Patients report witnessing multiple fatalities in graphic detail. Mrs. Caldwell specifically states she cannot remove the image of trapped workers from her memory and feels responsible for their deaths due to her family's connection to the facility." The cover-up had been comprehensive and systematic, involving legal intimidation, financial pressure, and the coordinated efforts of Rochester's most powerful institutions. Helena Caldwell's expression in the portrait reflected not only her personal trauma from witnessing the accident, but her knowledge that her family was actively participating in concealing the truth about workers' deaths from their survivors and the broader community. The systematic cover-up of the industrial accident explained why several prominent Rochester families had left the city during early 1906. But Dr. Barnes's investigation revealed that their departures were motivated by more than guilt or legal concerns. The families feared that their presence during the accident would eventually become public knowledge, destroying their social standing and potentially exposing them to criminal liability. Travel records and passport applications from the spring of 1906 showed a coordinated exodus of Rochester's elite families to European destinations. The Caldwells, Harrisons, Bennetts, and Pembertons had all arranged extended stays in England, France, and Switzerland, ostensibly for health and educational purposes, but clearly timed to remove them from potential legal proceedings. Helena Caldwell's portrait session on April 12, 1906, had been scheduled as one of her final appointments before the family's departure for London. According to letters preserved in family archives, Henry Caldwell had insisted that the family maintain all scheduled social obligations until their departure, believing that any sudden changes to their routine might attract unwanted attention. Dr. Barnes found evidence that Helena Caldwell had strongly opposed the portrait session, arguing in a letter to her sister that she was unable to present a normal appearance for photography, and feared that my distress will be permanently captured for all to see. However, her husband had overruled her concerns, viewing the portrait as necessary for maintaining the family's reputation before their extended absence. The letter to Helena's sister, dated April 11, 1906, provided heartbreaking insight into her mental state. "I cannot sleep without seeing their faces, Margaret. The sound of the machinery failing, the screaming, the blood. It haunts every moment. Henry insists we must appear normal, but I fear my face will betray what we witnessed. How can I smile for a photograph when those men's wives do not even know the truth about how their husbands died?" The family's European sojourn lasted nearly 2 years, during which time the immediate public attention surrounding the industrial accident faded. When they returned to Rochester in late 1907, the crisis had been largely forgotten, and the official version of events, a minor industrial accident with minimal casualties, had become accepted history. However, the trauma had permanently affected Helena Caldwell's mental health. Medical records from Dr. Thornfield showed continued treatment for anxiety and depression that persisted for years after her return to Rochester. Her social activities never fully resumed, and she became increasingly reclusive as she aged. Most tragically, the portrait that was meant to preserve a normal family image before their departure had instead captured the moment when Helena Caldwell's psychological defenses finally cracked under the weight of carrying such a devastating secret. Her expression revealed not just personal trauma, but the moral horror of participating in a cover-up that denied justice to the families of the dead workers. Dr. Barnes's investigation had uncovered a story that extended far beyond a single photograph. Helena Caldwell's terrifying expression in the 1906 portrait had documented not just a moment of personal anguish, but evidence of how industrial accidents were systematically covered up in early 20th century America, often with the complicity of the very families who had witnessed the tragedies. The photograph had preserved what the extensive cover-up had attempted to erase: authentic evidence of the trauma experienced by those who witnessed the deaths of 12 workers at Caldwell Agricultural Equipment. Helena Caldwell's inability to control her expression during the portrait session had created an unintentional historical document that contradicted decades of official denials and corporate whitewashing. Dr. Barnes's findings were published in the Journal of Industrial History, sparking renewed interest in workplace safety violations from the early 1900s. Her article, titled "Bearing Witness: Photographic Evidence of Trauma in Industrial Cover-Ups, 1906, provided detailed documentation of how powerful families had used their influence to suppress evidence of workplace fatalities. The Rochester Historical Society established a memorial exhibit honoring the workers who had died in the March 15, 1906 accident at Caldwell Agricultural Equipment. For the first time in over a century, the victims' names were publicly acknowledged, and their families' descendants learned the truth about how their ancestors had died. Labor historians used Dr. Barnes's research to re-examine other industrial accidents from the period, leading to the discovery that similar cover-ups had occurred throughout New York State's manufacturing sector. The systematic underreporting of workplace fatalities had been far more extensive than previously understood. Perhaps most significantly, Helena Caldwell's portrait was recognized as one of the earliest photographic documents of what would now be understood as post-traumatic stress disorder. Mental health historians noted that her expression captured the psychological impact of witnessing industrial violence, providing insight into how trauma was experienced and suppressed in an era before psychological conditions were medically recognized. The Morrison Photography Studio's notation about special circumstances for Helena Caldwell's session took on new meaning as evidence of the photographer's awareness that he was documenting someone in severe psychological distress. The portrait stood as testimony to both Helena's personal suffering and the broader human cost of industrial accidents that powerful interests worked to conceal. In the end, what Henry Caldwell had intended as a final gesture of normalcy before his family's flight from Rochester had instead preserved the evidence needed to restore dignity to the workers whose deaths had been deliberately hidden. Helena Caldwell's expression, frozen in sepia tones for over a century, had finally spoken for those who could no longer speak for themselves.